Happy autumn, everyone, and welcome back to the Wolverine Caucus series. Welcome back. We are here to talk about today's timely topic of elections 2012. The Wolverine Caucus is generously supported by the Office of the Vice President for Government Relations and the Alumni Association, and we're pleased that Kirk Lutz is here from the Alumni Association today, and thank you for joining us. We also are pleased that we're being filmed by Michigan Government Television, and this forum will be aired in the coming months. And I wanted to just make a note that Representative Jeff Irwin wanted to be here to introduce our speaker, but instead he's busy being state representative of the 53rd District of Ann Arbor. So in his place, we're going to have our co-chair of the Wolverine Caucus, Craig Ruff, to introduce the speaker. But let me just say something about Dr. Traugott. For the last number of years, we've had the privilege, every election cycle, of having this illustrious speaker come. And so by popular demand, we have now told him that this is a biannual caucus tradition. So now, without further ado, Craig Ruff will introduce the speaker. And again, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Well, before we get into the most exciting part of our program, many of you in this room knew Gary Olson. Gary, for those who have never had the pleasure of meeting, was for 2 decades the director of the Senate Fiscal Agency. He was a good friend of mine and was probably the kindest and most thoughtful person I've ever met around the state capitol. And he passed away yesterday after a terrible battle with cancer. So I would just like you to take 5 seconds, bow your head, and think good thoughts about Gary Olson. Thank you. Not to mention, he was an avid Wolverine. When I was at U of M in the 60s studying political science, it was kind of a tradition that we undergrads had to, every once in a while, go to the Institute for Survey Research, ISR, and we would have to bow down at the temple of global opinion research and honor Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes, who were key early inventors and analysts of political behavior. This guy, Mike Traugott, was at the knees of these titans, remains a major figure at the Institute for Survey Research, has written umpteen books and umpteen articles on political behavior, and without doubt is one of the world's foremost experts in examining why we do what we do and why we don't vote on election day. So, Mike Traugott, please come on up and share your knowledge.
Thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure for me to be back. I always enjoy coming to Lansing. I think about Veronica's invitation as a kind of a reliable harbinger of the fall. Actually, she starts in the summer. In the even-numbered years. I'm going to talk to you today about the current election campaign. I'm going to focus on the presidency. We can talk about other issues in the Q&A. I'm here to stay. I know that you have a 1 o'clock limit. Ordinarily, I'm here to stay and answer questions as long as you like. This is a better than average campaign from a political scientist perspective, and I'll try to say a little bit about why I think that is. So I want to say a couple of things by way of background to set a context for the other comments that I'm going to make. Greg talked about what political scientists call the Michigan model of elections. And that was developed out of surveys in the 1950s and published in a book called The American Voter, the Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes book. And it talked about long-term forces and short-term forces in campaigns. The main long-term force is party identification, the standing attachment that people have to a political party, not in a formal sense, but it's a social psychological attitude, how they think about themselves in terms of what the parties stand for. And then there are these short-term forces that are related to or function of the campaign context itself, evaluations of the candidates, and responses to the particular issue agenda that the candidates try to establish. Over time, that is since the 1960s, the relative power of party identification has waxed and waned, but we're in a period now which might be attributed partly to polarization, where party identification is now extremely strong predictor of vote choice. And as a result, this is a campaign in which a lot of people have made up their minds early. There are relatively few undecided voters for the candidates to contest. And that suggests that when we think about the standard strategies that candidates can employ, a strategy of mobilization, you identify your supporters, and then you make a special effort to get them out on election day, as opposed to a campaign of persuasion or conversion, where there are a lot of undecided people and you make issue-based appeals to them. This is clearly going to be a campaign about mobilization. And a lot of what will happen on election day, the outcome of the race, will depend upon who gets their supporters to the polls. The campaign, when we have an incumbent president, is always going to be about change at some level. And also, an incumbent can make an argument from the perspective of experience that they have as opposed to a challenger. But it also has this very strong element of staying the course, which is the Obama argument, the Obama theme reduced to a very simple statement, or the need for new policies, which is the Romney theme. And this, for a variety of reasons, not all involved with the presidential race. Gender has become an increasingly important part of American politics, but it's heightened in this particular campaign because of a series of events and incidents, maybe most importantly, the result of the primary for the Republican candidate for Senate in the state of Missouri, and also various issues related to health care and health care services for women. This is going to play an extremely important part in the campaign. Women have become very important in political campaigns since the 80s because women used to be a minority of the electorate, and they typically voted, those who did, in the same way that their husbands did. After the women's movement, women became more active, and they became, in the 90s, a majority of the electorate. And actually, the participation rate of women is now higher, the turnout rate of women is now higher than the turnout rate of men. And this wouldn't make so much difference if it weren't for the fact that women evaluate issues differently, and they have a tendency to support Democrats more than men. Men are more inclined to support Republican candidates. I'll show you some data. This has produced what we now all think of as the gender gap in voting patterns. And we expect the gender gap to be very substantial in the current election. So this is just to remind you about what happened in 2008. it was a pretty substantial, down at the bottom, it was a pretty substantial electoral vote victory for Barack Obama. The popular vote was about 53-47 in two-party terms. There's been a pretty significant analysis of voting patterns in 2008 by a number of political scientists that have come to essentially the same conclusion, that Barack Obama suffered a race penalty net of somewhere between 3 and 5 percentage points in the 2008 election. What does that mean? I'm going to talk eventually about economic models that predict support for presidential candidates. If we looked at economic circumstances, remember what happened in the fall of 2008 to the national economy and the world economy. The economic models, some economic models would have predicted that Barack Obama would have gotten about 68% of the vote, a challenge to a Republican incumbent, a challenge to a candidate who was from the same party as the incumbent party at the time that the economy went south. So the fact that he got 63% of the vote, 53% of the vote compared to 58% of the vote is this net assessment of a penalty that's attributed to racial attitudes. Now, there were parts of the voting patterns, the turnout related to Obama's victory that were positives. This is why I use the term net. He had a very great attraction to African American voters, and their turnout was stimulated. And more than 95% of African Americans voted for Barack Obama. He also stimulated turnout on college campuses and among young people who are historically a kind of a holy grail for candidates, although most times in behavioral terms, it turns out you invest a lot in trying to get them on your side, but then they turn out not to vote. Turnout was very high among college students in 2008, and Barack Obama received 2 out of 3 votes of college students, according to the exit polls. We don't expect the turnout is going to be as high as it was in the 2008 election, and that's why you may have heard about or read about this enthusiasm gap between Democrats and Republicans, this differential, as well as a general kind of malaise among the American population because of economic times. The 2010 election was a very important election because the Republicans had resounding victories all across the board. They elected, for example, 675 new state legislators. They increased the number of trifectas that they held, that is, where they control the House and the Senate and the governorship in a state. Michigan was a state that this happened to. And these mid-year elections are very important because in the years that end in 0, who controls the state legislature has control over redistricting. And the reallocation of seats, this is a chart about reallocation of seats, takes place because of the census that occurs in the year that ends in 0. But the consequence of the reallocation and the drawing of the lines of the districts takes place in the state legislature. So the Republicans got a big leg up on this. So this chart shows that if we had the election of 2008 with exactly the same outcome, Barack Obama would get 6 less electoral votes because the shift in population has generally been towards states that are controlled by Republicans or that gain seats in conjunction with this control. One of the key indicators of a president's prospects for re-election has to do with his favorability in the electorate, or generally his approval rating. And the president's approval rating currently is about 50%. I'll show you a little more about this in a moment. But these are some